Nigel Farage made a second maiden speech today in the House of Commons. It's not that common to make two maiden speeches, but he has done so. His first was on the 9th of July 2024, was as contentious as expected, and as leader of Reform UK and newly elected MP for Clacton, Farage wasted no time at all in making provocative remarks. He targeted former Speaker John Bercow, accusing him of attempting to overturn Brexit, labelling him as a little man who had besmirched the office of the Speaker, this in front of a sitting Speaker. The attack elicited groans from the chamber, reflecting the polarising nature of his comments, and today he made a second maiden speech in which he used his platform to call for a referendum on the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights, the ECHR. He argued that such a referendum is necessary to reassert British sovereignty and to address issues related to immigration and judicial decisions that he claims undermine UK law. His two speeches underscore his commitment to the populist and nationalist rhetoric that has defined his political career, and he made a passing note about the amount of money he could claw in while he was a member of the European Parliament, and how this was probably one reason why people liked the European Parliament. I'm sure it was a reason why so many UKIP and Brexit Party MEPs were able to enjoy their time without any fear that they would be held to account. Indeed, some of them have been allegedly rather remiss in making their attendance at that place. I don't know whether Mr. Farage will try to outdo the rumours about his non-attendance in the European Parliament by not attending the Parliament in Westminster. His speech underscored his commitment to this populist nationalist rhetoric that has defined his political career. His call for an ECHR referendum highlights a continued focus on issues of national sovereignty and legal independence. But a lot of his speech was made some very valid points. He talked about the housing shortage and that however many houses the Labour Party managed to build, the million or so houses that are intended to be built over the course of the Parliament, it's not going to make much of a hole in the problem that exists. He talked about migration and small boats. Again, reasonable points, and you might be surprised I'm saying that, but they are reasonable. The problem is there's a huge gap between stating the problem and identifying the solution. A sad, lonely, desperate figure, always seeking attention, and someone shouted spot on. Well, again, Mr. Farage manages to identify the truth. And as for his reference to smuggling gangs making serious money, he's absolutely right. And there was a very, very interesting programme on, I think, on the wireless the other day, on Radio 4, about the sheer amount of money that could be made in one crossing by an experienced smuggler and his or her cronies. And he's absolutely right that it's very difficult to identify and wipe out the drug trade because of the sheer amount of money that can be made. So it's about stopping that trade. And a deterrent, I don't believe, is the solution to the problem. I believe the solution is to set up consular access on the north side of France, in Turkey, in the north of Africa and so on, to actually discourage people from making the crossing in the first place. We need to change the way we understand migration and asylum, which means we need to be making consular access and the initial claims for asylum easier to make outside the country. And then we need to process the applications much more speedily. And finally, we need to redefine the distinction, or we need to make a distinction between a migrant and a refugee very clearly in a global agreement. That means we need to update the 1951 Refugee Convention. Now, without doing that, everything else is playing around with the wallpaper. We're just moving the pictures around and readjusting the lighting. That is all we're doing. We need to wallpaper the house. We need to do some serious spring cleaning. And that starts by going back to the legislation on which all this hinges and asking, is this fit? Is the 1951 Refugee Convention fit for the 21st century? And I think that will deal with the problems in America, the Mexico border. It will deal with the problems across the Channel. It will deal with the problems across the Mediterranean. Certainly, the idea of outsourcing accommodation while applications are processed is a reasonable thought, and we also need to outsource and bed in the accommodation of failed migrants in third countries, and ideally to discourage them from coming in the first place. But that is a bigger question. I don't think it's about a Rwanda-style solution. I think it might be about solutions being on offer to countries that are applying for membership to the European Union, and I think in the same way, spreading the burden of accommodating refugees across the whole of the continent is the way forward, rather than the older Dublin III protocol, which puts so much pressure on the countries in the southern Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, Spain, the poorer countries in the southern Mediterranean, that were not properly equipped to deal with it and have behaved, certainly in the case of Greece, appallingly, setting a standard for what they call pushbacks, what France calls pullbacks, and what we have tacitly accepted, though there's been some hand-wringing. And it's certainly not got as far out of hand as it's got in Greece. But this pushback thing was happening 20 plus years ago in the waters of Greece. And I was involved in a court case which took Greece to court for the mistreatment of migrants seeking asylum in Greece. They were treated appallingly, and Greece's approach was not dissimilar to the approach taken by the last government, which was not to process, which was to leave the migrants to their own devices, giving them flimsy pink cards and hoping that eventually they would go away, bribing them with cars that didn't quite work, doing everything possible except for actually dealing with the paperwork. And we have rewarded the Greek Navy with a senior role in the Border Patrol, the International Border Patrol Agency, Frontex. And I'm sure this is an area where Mr. Farage and I would absolutely agree. His call for a referendum on the ECHR, I think we would not agree on that, and I don't think we would agree on a lot of his solutions to the problems, but we would agree on the statement of the problems, absolutely, as I think we would have agreed, or we did agree, on the concerns about the overripe bureaucracy that was overwhelming Europe and the inefficiencies that were overwhelming Europe, and the need for Europe to have a spring clean, to have an improvement, to have a rethink. He and I would have disagreed, and we did disagree, about the concept of a formal Brexit. I don't think we would definitely have disagreed about the threat of a Brexit, but we certainly would have disagreed about the implementation of Brexit. And I think in so many ways Nigel Farage is wrong. I also think in so many ways he is one of the most inspired speakers in the present chamber of the House of Commons. And it would be a great shame if he were to follow this maiden speech by a period of absence. I hope we'll see him many more times in the House of Commons. And to that effect, I'm going to play the entire speech because I think it was so good. And on the understanding that there's not going to be lots of comments that I'm in favour of what Farage says. I'm not. But I am in favour of how he says it. And there's a big difference. And I thought it was interesting the person who spoke next read from her notes. And the person who spoke before him read from notes. And Farage is among the few. Richard Tice, incidentally, gave a very good speech without notes. I wish more parliamentarians would do the same. I noticed Stephen Flynn sitting in front of Farage, wagging his head and looking miserable. But he, I'm sure, would have noted a fellow traveller in terms of ability and mastery of rhetorical flourish. That said, yes, he's had 21 years to prepare for this, and his range of oratory is limited to a particular subject matter, but that subject matter is beautifully polished, and he pulls it off magnificently. And if anybody wants to learn about rhetoric and about commanding attention with a verbal flourish, this is the man to learn it from. This is a man who is extraordinarily proficient and extraordinarily skilled. So with that recommendation, let's listen to what he's actually got to say.
Later on, but the point has been noted. I call Nigel Farage to make his maiden speech.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. I believe it's customary in a maiden speech to pay tribute to your predecessor, which I'm very happy to do. Giles Watling, a very decent, nice, honourable man, former actor, wears his Garrick Club tie, nothing even vaguely conservative about him, but a jolly nice chap, and it was a clean fought campaign. The Right Honourable Member for Holland and South Deepings earlier made reference to Clacton as being the place for a traditional English seaside holiday, and indeed it is, with its pier and its miles of sandy beaches and its arcades, and perhaps it's not the holiday that's as popular as it used to be now that people go to Spain and elsewhere, but it's still there. There are other parts of the constituency that are genteel, quite wealthy, but if we go to places like Jaywick, we find the most deprived community in the whole of the United Kingdom. Those communities have little faith or trust or belief that government can make their lives better. Indeed, what I found knocking on doors were people saying, we want to work, we want to get on, we want to make money. But as soon as we work for 16 hours a week or more, our benefits get taken away. We're better off staying on benefits. And I have to say, I feel immensely sorry for people who the benefit system, which is designed to help them, is actually keeping them trapped in levels of relative poverty. So I will do my best as the MP for the area to bring business, investment, private money into the constituency with jobs and training and skills. I can't promise that I'll do it, but I will do my absolute damnedest to make it happen. Now, it's funny because I spent nearly 21 years as a member of the European Parliament in Brussels and with its monthly journey to Strasbourg. And I have to say, this place is very different indeed. It's smaller. There is not a chauffeur-driven Mercedes available for each member. No large lump sums of money, which you don't have to spend on anything and show no receipts for. And I wonder whether perhaps that's why so many in the British political system seem to adore the European Union so much, because it is a rather wonderful place to work. What I perhaps didn't expect was to come here and to find that I'm more outnumbered with my reform team, more outnumbered here than we were in the European Parliament, because there are more supporters of Brexit in the European Parliament than I sense there are in this Parliament of 2024. This is very much a Remainers Parliament. I suspect in many cases it's really a Rejoiners Parliament. But the other issue, and it's very interesting as we debate the King's speech, if you look at the speech itself, the word immigration is mentioned only twice, and asylum just once. And perhaps this is not a surprise, as when Sir Keir Starmer laid out the 6 big priorities for the general election for the Labour Party, he didn't mention legal or illegal immigration. And that's the other area in which I think the 5 of us sitting over here are going to find ourselves massively outnumbered in this House, is because we actually do want to talk about these issues. You see, I believe that the population explosion is having the biggest impact on the quality of life of ordinary folk than any other issue. It all started, of course, when the current Home Secretary became a Member of Parliament back in May '97. And it's worth reminding ourselves that net migration was the same during the late 1940s, the whole of the 1950s, the whole of the 1960s, the whole of the 1970s, the whole of the 1980s, and the 1990s up until Mr. Blair. Net migration had run at 30 to 50,000 a year for over half a century. Then Mr. Blair gets in and decides we're going to open the doors in a way that had never been done before, to the delight and joy of big companies and especially giant multinationals who have always wanted as much cheap labour as they can get, and to hell with the consequences for working class families and people. But perhaps it was even more of a surprise to see that that massive acceleration in our population through immigration would then, by a Conservative Party, who despite promises in 4 consecutive manifestos, actually accelerate what had happened under the years of Mr. Blair. And so we see a population increase of 10 million people since that time that Labour won its last landslide. Even the net figure is a migrant a minute. Even during the course of this debate, many hundreds more people will come to our country. And nobody is making the argument that there aren't some exceptionally wonderful people among them. There are, of course. But the sheer level of population means we have to build a new house every 2 minutes, even if the Labour government is able to fulfil the 1.5 million houses that it wants to build during the lifetime of this Parliament. It will make no dent at all on the current shortage of housing. Rents have risen by 25% since 2021. Why? Population increase and pressure. And the list goes on through access to health services, to congestion, to pressure on infrastructure. The population crisis is the biggest impact affecting people's lives, damaging their quality of life, and virtually nobody in this place even wants to talk about it. But perhaps it's on illegal immigration that I do really want to make a point. 4 years ago, I went out into the English Channel repeatedly, filming dinghies coming across the channel, dinghies with an average of 16 people per boat. I was described as being a sad, lonely, desperate figure, always seeking attention. And I've no doubt there are some that think that's still the case today. Thank you. But I did it because it was obvious to me what was going to happen. It was obvious that there would be a huge influx of people illegally coming to Britain across the English Channel, and it would happen because we'd stopped deporting people who came to Britain illegally. And perhaps the Labour Party might want to reflect themselves on the last period of Labour government, where we had Home Secretaries like David Blunkett, far, far to the right of people like the Shadow Home Secretary today. You came to Britain illegally during the last Labour government. Your feet didn't touch the sides. You were gone, you were out. Indeed, in the last year of the Labour government, from 2009 to 10, 50,000 people who came here illegally were deported. Now, none of that happens anymore. It didn't happen under 14 years of Conservatives, and it clearly isn't going to happen under this Labour government. And I wonder why. I think you'll find it's the increased role of a court overseas that was set up in the wake of World War II with the very, very best of intentions that has now completely outlived its usefulness. It is, of course, called the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, and it was the Labour government that enshrined the Convention into British law. We will not stop the boats, even if we send a handful to Rwanda. We will not stop the boats by attempting to smash the criminal gangs. We've been doing that to the drugs industry in Britain year after year, decade after decade, with no success whatsoever. Yeah. The financial rewards for smuggling people across the English Channel can now net a gang 2 to 3 million euros a week. Whatever prison sentences or penalties are put upon them, there will always be people volunteering to make millions of euros a week. We will only stop this if we start deporting people that come illegally. Then they won't pay the smugglers. But we'll only do that by leaving the ECHR. But I've got a fun suggestion that I think would liven up politics, engage the public, and see a massively increased turnout. Why don't we have a referendum on whether we continue to be members of the ECHR?
I called Lola McAvoy to make her maiden speech.
So there is, of course, no way that I'm going to endorse his calls for a referendum on the ECHR. But this continued focus on issues of national sovereignty, excellent. Legal independence, excellent. But resonating with the themes that have characterized his advocacy for diversion and disquiet and frustration and noise since the Brexit campaign. It's typical Farage. It's done with polish, a touch of humour, and what I think so fascinating is the humour always comes across in Nigel Farage's speeches, but in personal life he seems to be a little bit prickly, and he doesn't really like to be the butt of jokes, as Clive Dunn would have said. He doesn't like it Upham, does he? But he likes to put it out there, and he likes to ridicule others. He doesn't like to be ridiculed himself. But there's a smile through the way he speaks, and I like the way he speaks. I think he should be saluted, and one should always look for the positives, and the positive here is just the sheer brilliance of the man who can do it. And I wish there were more.